Tonight, let's take a quiet journey back to the 1860s, when workers laid rails across the vast American continent, connecting east to west for the first time. The idea seems obvious now. Of course, there should be a railroad spanning the nation, but in the years before the Civil War, the project seemed nearly impossible. The distances were immense, the terrain was brutal, the politics were complicated, and yet, somehow, the work got done. Let us begin by understanding the scale of the challenge. From the eastern railheads to the Pacific coast, the distance was nearly 2,000 miles. In between lay prairies, deserts, and mountain ranges. Rivers had to be crossed. Tunnels had to be carved through solid rock. Bridges had to be built over gorges and canyons. And all of this had to be done with the technology of the mid-19th century, without the power tools and heavy machinery we take for granted today. Two companies took on the task. The Central Pacific Railroad would build eastward from Sacramento, California, climbing over the Sierra Nevada mountains and crossing the high deserts of Nevada and Utah. The Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska, crossing the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. Somewhere in the middle, the two lines would meet. The Central Pacific faced the mountains first. The Sierra Nevada rises like a wall along California's eastern border, its peaks reaching 10,000 feet and higher. Snow falls heavily in winter, burying the passes under drifts 20 or 30 feet deep. Building a railroad over this barrier would require engineering on a scale never before attempted. Work began in 1863, though progress was slow at first. Labor was scarce. Many able-bodied men had gone east to fight in the Civil War. Those who remained often preferred the gold fields to the hard work of grading and laying track. The company struggled to find enough workers to keep the project moving. The solution came from an unexpected source. Chinese immigrants, many of whom had come to California during the gold rush, proved willing and able to do the work. At first, skeptics doubted whether men of smaller stature could handle the physical demands of railroad construction. But the Chinese workers quickly proved themselves. They were disciplined, hardworking, and skilled. By 1865, Chinese workers made up the majority of the Central Pacific's workforce, eventually numbering over 10,000 men. These workers organized themselves into crews of about a dozen men each, often from the same district in China. They selected their own leaders, managed their own affairs, and maintained their own traditions far from home. They cooked their own food, preferring rice, dried fish, and vegetables to the beef and bread favored by other workers. They drank tea rather than whiskey. Their camps were orderly and quiet compared to the rough settlements of their Irish counterparts. The work they did was extraordinarily dangerous. In the high Sierra, crews carved ledges out of sheer granite cliffs. Workers were lowered in baskets over the edge, where they would drill holes in the rock, pack them with black powder, light the fuses, and signal frantically to be pulled up before the explosions. Not all of them made it. The mountain claimed many lives. Some bodies were never recovered, left in the rubble of collapsed ledges or buried by avalanches. The technique required remarkable precision. A ledge carved at the wrong angle would be useless. The curves had to be exactly right for locomotives to navigate safely. Workers measured and remeasured, drilling and blasting with care despite the impossible working conditions. Dangling on ropes above 1,000-foot drops, they shaped the granite to the engineer's specifications. The tunnels were even more challenging. Through the heart of the Sierra, workers had to blast a series of tunnels through solid granite. The longest of these, the Summit Tunnel, stretched over 1,700 feet through the mountain's peak. Progress was measured in inches per day, sometimes as little as 8 inches in 24 hours. Workers attacked the rock from both ends and from a central shaft, trying to speed the work. In winter, they labored underground while avalanches swept across the surface above them. To reach the central shaft, workers had to be lowered hundreds of feet through a vertical hole in the mountain. They worked in shifts around the clock, the tunnel lit by flickering candles and oil lamps. The air was thick with dust and powder smoke. Ventilation was primitive at best. Workers coughed and strained to breathe in the choking atmosphere. The explosive of choice was black powder, packed into holes drilled by hand. The drilling alone was exhausting work. A team of workers would take turns swinging heavy hammers, driving steel drills into the rock inch by inch. The drill holders rotated the steel between blows, ensuring the hole remained round and true. When the hole was deep enough, they would pack it with powder, insert a fuse, and retreat before the blast. Then the rubble would be cleared, and the process would begin again. Later in the project, a new explosive became available. Nitroglycerin was far more powerful than black powder, but also far more dangerous. The slightest shock could set it off. Workers died when batches exploded during transport or handling. Entire crews were killed in accidents that left nothing behind but shattered rock and silence. But nitroglycerin could blast through rock that black powder could barely scratch, and so its use continued despite the risks. The pace of tunneling increased dramatically once the new explosive was adopted. The winters of 1866 and 1867 were particularly brutal. Snowfall in the Sierra Nevada reached record levels. Workers lived in tunnels dug beneath the snow, their camps buried under drifts that sometimes reached 40 feet. They shoveled constantly, trying to keep pathways open between the work sites. Avalanches struck without warning, burying men and equipment. Rescue teams dug frantically through the snow, but often found only bodies. Despite these conditions, work continued through the winter months. The company could not afford to wait for spring. Every month of delay meant additional expense, and the risk that the Union Pacific would claim more of the route. Workers pushed forward by the light of lanterns, blasting and digging in conditions that would seem unimaginable today. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mountains, the Union Pacific was making its way across the Great Plains. The terrain here was easier, mostly flat grassland with few natural obstacles, but the plains presented their own challenges. There was no timber for ties and trestles. Trees had to be shipped in from distant forests or harvested from river bottoms and mountain slopes far from the rail line. Each mile of track required about 2,500 wooden ties, and the wood had to come from somewhere. Logging crews worked far ahead of the rail line, felling trees and shaping them into ties that would be loaded onto trains and shipped to the construction front. Water was scarce as well. Steam locomotives required vast quantities of water to operate, and the alkaline streams of the high plains often proved unsuitable. The mineral content would scale and damage boilers. Wells had to be dug, sometimes to considerable depth. Water tanks had to be constructed at regular intervals along the line. Without water, the trains could not run, and without trains, the construction could not proceed. Fuel posed similar problems. Locomotives burned wood or coal, and neither was readily available on the open prairie. Supply trains had to haul fuel from distant sources, adding to the logistical complexity of the project. The railroad was like a living thing, requiring constant nourishment to keep moving forward. The workforce of the Union Pacific was different from that of the Central Pacific. Many of the laborers were Irish immigrants, veterans of the Civil War, or African Americans seeking opportunity in the West. They lived in temporary camps that moved with the construction, rough towns of tents and wooden shacks that sprang up and vanished as the railroad advanced. These camps were wild places. Gambling, drinking, and violence were common. The workers earned their pay through hard labor, and many spent it quickly in the makeshift saloons that followed the construction westward. Newspapers called these mobile towns Hell on Wheels, and the name stuck. Each camp had its gamblers and its dance hall girls, its whiskey dealers and its undertakers. Law enforcement was minimal, and disputes were often settled with fists or guns. The work itself was organized with military precision. Each morning, flat cars loaded with rails and ties would advance to the end of the existing track. Teams of workers would unload the materials and carry them forward. The rails, each weighing 700 pounds, were carried by crews of men working in synchronized rhythm. They would drop the rail in place, spike it down, and move to the next. The spike drivers were the aristocrats of the construction crews. Working in pairs, they swung heavy hammers in alternating rhythm, driving 10 spikes per rail, 3 blows per spike. The ring of their hammers became the heartbeat of the construction, a steady percussion that marked the advance of the line. On a good day, construction crews might lay 2 or 3 miles of track. On exceptional days, driven by competition and the promise of bonuses, they might lay even more. The record came near the end of construction, when Central Pacific workers laid over 10 miles of track in a single day, a feat that has never been equaled. They worked from dawn until after dark, laying 3,520 rails and driving 28,160 spikes in 12 hours of continuous labor. As the two lines approached each other, the competition intensified. Both companies received government subsidies for each mile of track they completed. The more miles they built, the more money they made. This led to increasingly frantic construction, with crews working around the clock under the light of bonfires and lanterns. Quality sometimes suffered in the rush. Curves were cut too sharp. Grades were steeper than they should have been. Roadbeds were not always properly compacted. Some sections would need to be rebuilt later, at considerable expense. But in the moment, the imperative was speed. Get the track laid, connect the coasts. The route crossed lands that were not empty. Native American peoples had lived on these plains and mountains for generations. The railroad disrupted their lives profoundly. The great buffalo herds that sustained many plains tribes were killed by hunters who shot from train windows, leaving the carcasses to rot on the prairie. Traditional hunting grounds were bisected by the iron rails. The steady advance of settlers along the rail corridor transformed the landscape and displaced its original inhabitants. Conflicts arose, sometimes violent, as indigenous peoples resisted the incursion into their territories. Raiding parties attacked work crews and surveying parties. Telegraph lines were cut. Isolated stations were burned. The workers lived with this danger constantly. Armed guards accompanied the construction trains. Workers kept their rifles close at hand. The building of the railroad was not just an engineering project, but also a chapter in the longer story of Western expansion and its consequences for those who had lived on the land before. Through all these obstacles, the work continued. The Central Pacific pushed east through Nevada's high desert, laying track across alkali flats where summer temperatures soared above 100 degrees. Workers suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration. The Union Pacific pushed west through Wyoming, climbing the Continental Divide through passes that would see heavy snow in winter. The two lines crept toward each other, mile by hard-won mile. Bridge building was a specialty unto itself. Timber trestles spanned ravines and rivers, their wooden frameworks rising sometimes 100 feet or more above the water. These structures were built quickly, intended to be replaced later with more permanent spans. Some of them stood for years, swaying slightly as heavy trains crossed, a testament to the skill of their builders and perhaps a bit of luck as well. The larger bridges were engineering marvels. The Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming stretched over a gorge 600 feet wide and 130 feet deep. Built of timber with iron reinforcement, it seemed impossibly fragile for the loads it would carry. But it held, at least until it could be replaced with a sturdier structure years later. Water crossings required even more ingenuity. Where rivers were too deep for trestles, workers built cofferdams to hold back the current while they constructed stone or timber piers. In some cases, they drove piles deep into the riverbed, creating foundations that would support the weight of locomotives and freight cars. Each crossing presented unique challenges, and engineers had to adapt their methods to local conditions. The winter of 1867 to 1868 was particularly harsh in the Sierra Nevada. Snowfall broke records. Avalanches swept away entire work camps. The Central Pacific responded by building miles of wooden snow sheds over the track, creating covered corridors that would protect the line from the heaviest drifts. These structures used millions of board feet of lumber and required their own army of workers to construct. Some of these snow sheds remain today, still serving their original purpose more than a century and a half later. As the two lines approached their meeting point, the question arose, where exactly should they connect? Neither company wanted to stop building, as each mile of track brought additional subsidies. At one point, the two lines actually graded parallel routes, passing each other without connecting, each company determined to claim as much territory as possible. The absurdity of this situation finally forced government intervention. Congress designated Promontory Summit in Utah as the meeting point. The date was set for May 10, 1869. After 6 years of labor, thousands of workers, and hundreds of lives lost, the two lines would finally be joined. The ceremony that day was elaborate but brief. Dignitaries gathered on the windswept plateau. Speeches were made. 2 locomotives, one from each company, faced each other across the final gap. The final rail was laid, and special spikes were prepared for the occasion, 1 of gold, 1 of silver, and 2 of blended metals. The golden spike was more symbolic than practical. It was too soft to be driven with force, so holes were pre-drilled to receive it. Even so, the first attempt to tap it home missed the mark. The telegraph operator, who had wired his key to the rail to send news of each blow across the nation, sent the signal anyway. Across America, bells rang and cannons fired in celebration. The continent was connected. What the railroad meant for the nation became apparent almost immediately. Journeys that had taken months by wagon now took days by train. Goods could move freely between coasts. Letters and newspapers traveled at speeds unimaginable just years before. The economic impact was transformative, knitting together a nation that had recently been divided by civil war. For the workers who built the line, the completion brought mixed feelings. Chinese workers, despite their essential contribution, faced continued discrimination. New laws restricted their immigration and denied them basic rights. Many moved to cities where they formed tight-knit communities. Others returned to China, carrying with them skills and savings from years of hard labor. Their contribution was largely forgotten for decades, only recently receiving the recognition it deserves. Irish workers dispersed as well, some settling in the new towns that sprang up along the line, others moving on to new construction projects as the network of railroads expanded across the West. The railroad, once built, required relatively few workers to maintain. The vast armies of laborers were no longer needed. The towns that grew along the route prospered or faded according to their usefulness to the railroad. Junction points and water stops became cities. Cheyenne and Laramie, Reno and Ogden, these places owed their existence to the iron rails that passed through them. Bypass settlements withered into ghost towns, their wooden buildings slowly decaying on the empty plains. The railroad determined the geography of development, deciding which communities would thrive and which would disappear. The environmental impact was substantial as well. Forests were cleared for ties and fuel. Buffalo were slaughtered to the point of near extinction, their bones gathered years later and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer. Prairie was plowed and planted as settlers moved west along the rail corridor. The landscape was transformed in ways that would have been unthinkable without the railroad's existence. The railroad changed the very experience of space and time. Distances that had seemed insurmountable became manageable. A journey that once meant months of hardship and danger could now be completed in comfort and safety within a week. Time zones, which had been informal and local, became standardized to accommodate the railroad schedule. The nation began to think of itself differently, as a unified whole rather than a collection of distant regions. In the years following completion, the original Transcontinental route was improved and expanded. The hasty sections were rebuilt to higher standards. Stronger bridges replaced the temporary timber trestles. New lines branched off to serve additional cities and industries. The single thread became a web, connecting every corner of the continent. Let us pause now to consider what that work must have been like. Imagine yourself on a summer morning in the High Sierra. The air is thin at this elevation, and the sun is fierce. You are part of a crew drilling holes in granite for the day's blasting. The hammer rises and falls, ringing against the steel drill. Your arms ache from the repetition. Dust fills your lungs. Around you, other crews work at similar tasks. The sound of hammering echoes off the rock walls. Somewhere below, a locomotive whistle signals the arrival of supply trains. The smell of black powder drifts from yesterday's blasting site. You know the dangers. You have seen men fall. You have carried the injured to the rough camp hospital. But you continue day after day because the work must be done and because the pay, while modest, is better than nothing. Or imagine yourself on the plains of Nebraska, laying track under a summer sun that beats down without mercy. The prairie stretches to the horizon in every direction. No trees offer shade. No streams offer cool water. Just the grass, the wind, and the endless iron rails stretching behind you. You work with your crew and practice rhythm, lift the rail, carry it forward, drop it in place, drive the spikes, move to the next. The work is monotonous but demanding. Your muscles remember the motions even when your mind wanders. At night, you return to camp. The food is plain but filling. You sleep in a canvas tent or a rough wooden bunkhouse. You might write a letter home by candlelight telling family members about this strange and vast country you are helping to connect. You might play cards with fellow workers or simply collapse into exhausted sleep. Tomorrow you will do it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until finally, one day, you reach the end. The camps had their own rhythms and routines. Supply trains arrived with regularity, bringing food and equipment, mail and news. Paymasters came monthly, distributing wages and gold and silver coins. Workers sent money home to families in Ireland, in China, in the cities of the East. They were building more than a railroad. They were building futures for themselves and those they loved. The dangers were constant, but so was the camaraderie. Workers looked out for one another. They shared food and tobacco. They warned each other of loose rock and unstable ground. In the evenings, they told stories and sang songs from their homelands. Despite the hardships, despite the dangers, despite being far from home, they found moments of companionship and even joy. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad did not think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as workers doing a job for pay, but their labor created something lasting, something that changed the course of a nation. Consider the scope of what they accomplished. They moved mountains of rock, they bridged chasms and gorges, they laid track across deserts where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees and through mountain passes buried under 40 feet of snow. They did all of this with hand tools, with black powder, and later nitroglycerin, with raw muscle and determination. The records they set still stand. No one has matched the 10 miles of track laid in a single day by the Central Pacific crews. No one has bored through granite faster than those workers in the Summit Tunnel, once nitroglycerin became available. The speed of the overall construction, given the technology of the time, remains remarkable even by modern standards. The trains that cross the country today follow routes that those workers surveyed. The tunnels they blasted through granite still carry freight. The cuts they carved through mountain passes still channel the rail lines. The achievement endures, even as the names of individual workers have been largely forgotten. We know a few names: the engineers who designed the route, the executives who raised the capital, the politicians who authorized the project. But the workers themselves remain mostly anonymous: the Chinese laborers who carved Cape Horn, the Irish spike drivers who laid track across the plains, the countless others who gave their strength and sometimes their lives to the work. In recent years, efforts have been made to honor their memory. Monuments have been erected. Their stories have been told in books and documentaries. The Chinese workers in particular have finally received some of the recognition they deserve. Their contribution was essential, and for too long it went unacknowledged. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you can imagine the sound of those distant hammers, the ring of steel on rock, the hiss of steam from waiting locomotives, the shouts of foremen, and the quiet conversations of workers in their native tongues. The work is done now. The rails are laid. The continent is connected. The trains run smoothly over tracks that were won, inch by inch, from mountain and plain. Somewhere tonight, a freight train rumbles through the Sierra Nevada, following the path carved by those workers more than a century and a half ago. The tunnels they blasted still echo with the passage of trains. The grades they graded still carry the weight of commerce. The work endures. The connection remains. And in the quiet of the night, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear the distant ring of hammers on steel. Rest well.